afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. So normally everybody is muted until apart the people who are speaking. And then for sure, everybody will have the possibility to talk. So on the behalf of the Institute of African Studies and the IFRA-Nigeria, whom I'm the director, I welcome everybody to the second session of the interdisciplinary seminar or series organized by IFRA-Nigeria and the Institute of African Studies. Before introducing Professor Sanya Osha, today's speaker, and Dr. Philip Ademola Olayoku, who is acting as a discussant, let me spend just a few introductory words about the seminar general theme, critical decolonialities in an Afro-global perspective. The concept of coloniality and decoloniality, which have to be used in a variety of ways, both academic and non-academic, require not only the construction and critics, but also contextualization. To say that, the seminar highlights the African point of view, but even though to say that African point of view is a useful synthesis, it's also too general and ambitious, as there is no single African point of view, and we don't have the desire to give a definitive answer, but to open the door to conversation and questions. On the other hand, by initiating this dialogue from Africa, the intent is to bring to the forefront thinkers who are maybe not forgotten, but perhaps not sufficiently valued or recognized. The aim is also to address an audience in two linguistic areas, English-speaking and French-speaking, and we know how delicate the translation of concept can be with the shifting meanings and multiple different uses. As an example, I would like to mention the connotation and uses of the word indigenous and indigène in the two languages and the divergent or even problematic interpretation, including disciplinary ones. Today, the approach of decoloniality is mainly that of philosophy. Shall we call it African philosophy? Professor Osha will tell us, but I would add it's a philosophy which opens to other disciplines such as anthropology, cultural studies, and political systems. Without further delay, I'd like to introduce Professor Sanya Osha, who lives and works in South Africa. He holds a PhD in philosophy and taught this discipline in Nigerian University for a decade before taking up a number of research fellowships and positions in South Africa, United States, and the Netherlands. He has published extensively on anthropology, cultural studies, the politics of West African region, and the socio-political and cultural realities of Southern Africa. His research themes are very wide. They go from the discursive status of African systems of knowledge to the sociological and political aspect of innovation studies. As an academic, he has held a research position at various institutions like Smith College in the USA, the University of Groningen and the African Studies Center in the Netherlands, and in numerous prestigious universities in South Africa. Some of his academic publications includes Quasi Wiredu, the text, writing and thought in Africa, Post-Ethnophilosophy, African Post-Colonial Modernity, Informal Subjectivities and the Democratic Consensus, Dani Nabudere's Africology, A Quest for African Holism, and Ken Saro-Wiwa's Shadow, Politics, Nationalism, and the Ogoni Protest Movement. By the way, he is also a well-known novelist. I have also the pleasure to introduce Dr. Philip Ademola Olayoku, who works and lives in Nigeria. He has a doctorate in peace and conflict studies from the University of Ibadan, where he taught as an adjunct. He is the founder and coordinator of the West African Transitional Justice Center and also the chair of Marcel Advisory. He consulted on the media and terrorism project for the Center for Journalism Innovation and Development and served on the International Advisory Board of Médecins Sans Frontières. He has a critical approach to decoloniality, as advocated in his recent article on tech-alienation and decolonizing reparations in African intra-diasporic context. He has also co-authored works on developing organic approaches to restitutions. His recent works include Tech Hedonism as Metaverse in the Future of Nigerian Netizen Sociopolitics, published by the Digital Policy Studies Journal, and Anti-Semitism, Intersection of Politics, Religion, and Consanguinity Among Nigerian Jews, published by the Bulletin de l'Observatoire International du Religieux. Before giving the floor to Professor Osha, I would like to remind you all that the conference is registered and will be posted on IFRA-Nigeria website in a few days. You are invited to use the chat for reaction, comments, questions. After the presentation and discussion, a session of question and answer will be open. We would like to advise you to write your question if your internet is not stable, or to raise your hand if you have a good connection. Professor Osha, you have the floor now. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good day everybody, wherever you are. Thank you so much for attending. Before I start, I'd like to thank the Director of IFRA, Dr. Barbara Morovich, and our team, especially Mr. Emmanuel Udo and Mrs. Edafe, and then also the Director of the Institute of African Studies, Professor Sanya Osha, who I've known for several years now. So I'm hoping to see him here. And every one of you, thanks for coming. I'd like to begin by, and then also please, I thank the discussant, Dr. Philip Olayoku, for attending. I'm looking forward to the exchange with him and with also all of you there. I'd like to preface my discussion with a focus on some of my key terms, key concepts. But the title of the presentation is Decolonial Approaches in African Epistemologies in the Global South. Decoloniality is a very important concept. Some would even call it a theory, which was popularized, of course, by the Latin American scholars such as Walter Mignolo and Nelson M. Torres, people like that. But the genealogy of my use of the concept or term begins in Africa, even though I know that it's been popularized by other scholars around the world. And I take my cue from Walter Mignolo himself when he came to South Africa. He had said that when they were asking him, "Oh, we're really interested in this concept. How did you come across it? How did you develop it?" And he said, "No, I mean, I got it from you Africans." Which is true, I got it from you Africans, and I agree with him totally. But I also take inspiration from the Kenyan theorist and novelist, theorist and culture theorist, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who said, decolonization is a global project. It's a global project. It's a vast global project spanning several disciplines, from linguistics to language to history to philosophy to literature. So it's a vast interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary project, and it covers the entire globe. I totally agree with him. So those are some of my key thinkers that, but there are others which I'll come to, but I just want to clarify. So that is how I use, that's when I take my antecedents, the genealogy of the term, where I draw my inspiration from. People like African thinkers like Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who I'll be talking extensively about later on. And some thinkers also like Olabi, a philosopher / scholar from the Benin Republic. So those are my brief remarks on decolonial, how I use the term and how I approach it in this discussion. And then we come to another important concept, African epistemologies. Africana epistemologies, rather. Africana epistemologies refers to African influenced epistemological traditions from across the globe, not only on the African homeland, but in multiple African diasporas, spanning Europe, the Americas, that's North America, Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. So that's the geographical scope of what I tend to be Africana, and then the epistemologies that are derived from these various geographical locations, coupled with the fact that a lot of the epistemologies we're talking about here are influenced by Africans who are located not only in the homeland, but also, like I said, in the diaspora. And then the global South too would encompass the same geographical location I have defined. Now, the structure of my presentation are threefold. First of all, I would like to discuss an important philosopher in relation to what we regard to conceptual decolonization, and of course, by extension, to decoloniality. The Ghanaian philosopher Kwesi Wiredu, born in 1931, and then who passed away in January 2022. He actually worked a bit at the University of Ibadan, and he was very influential in shaping the Ibadan School of Philosophy, or what can be regarded as that from his very, very important work. The other thinker I'll be discussing is his great contemporary and colleague, Paulon Otunji, who was from the Benin Republic, born in 1942, and passed on in February 2024 at the age of 82, I think, 82. So they were contemporaries, and their work overlapped. There are several instances, although they're very different. One is Anglophone, which is Kwesi Wiredu, and the other is Francophone, which is Paulon Otunji, and so those differences are quite obvious, but at the same time, like I said, there are similarities in the kind of project they pursue, because they were both trying to build viable modern philosophical practices in Africa. So those are two of the key thinkers I'll be talking about. And then the final thinker I should mention is Olabi, who is also from the Benin Republic, but he's Yoruba, so he has very strong links to Nigeria. He studied and worked in Nigeria. He studied first also after a period in Sorbonne. He came back in Sorbonne, France. He came back to Nigeria and worked at got his master's degree at University of Ibadan, where you are, and then he worked there for a bit, and then transferred to about what was then University of Ife, now Obafemi University, and spent several years there before going to the US. He's a very important philosophical figure for me, even though he's not as discussed as the two other philosophers have mentioned. But we'll see why he's important, because he in the last stages of his work, he focused almost exclusively on a concept called global Africa. And I think this is very important to decolonial discourse, decolonial theory. So those are the key three philosophers that we'll be discussing. If we have time, I was told I have 40 to 45 minutes, I will discuss a bit about the epistemic traditions to be found principally in South America, and particularly in Brazil, and their connections to the Gulf of Guinea, which can be found largely in West Africa. And we'll try and establish certain historical, epistemic, and cultural connections and continuities between these two different regions. Yes, what we have to recognize and appreciate is that they were joined by certain similar historical experiences, the experiences of slavery, experiences of colonization, and experiences of decolonization and deracialization, the final term in relation to Brazil. So that is the scope of my discussion. Those are sort of the issues I'll be touching on. So I'll begin, first of all, by discussing the work of Kwesi Wiredu. For me, he's one of the most important philosophers. Well, I mean, he was regarded for many years before he died as perhaps the greatest living African philosopher, and quite rightly so, because of his contributions to modern African philosophy. And I take it, and this is particularly evident in his development of a theory of conceptual decolonization. And what does it mean by conceptual decolonization? He says, since we're trying to build viable African philosophical practices, we should look at our Western philosophical heritage, which has become global, and try and translate those sort of concepts and theories and approaches in local indigenous languages to see if they are viable. And he started by some of the basic concepts in Western philosophy, concepts such as truth, God, mind, fact, and what have you. And he tries to see that he's from the Akan ethnicity in Ghana. He tries to see if they are viable in his own Akan context. And so it's a project of both epistemological comparison and linguistic comparison, linguistic analysis. So he has to be quite skillful, quite competent, quite proficient in his use of both language, of the English language, and also the Akan language. And he must also know quite well the cultural and epistemological backgrounds of these two different cultures, one European, the other one African, Akan in this sense. So and doing that by this project of comparative analysis from an epistemological point of view, and also from a linguistic point of view, he was able to develop a modern African philosophical practice. It's apparently simple, it's apparently basic, but it has been very effective, very influential across the Anglophone divide of African philosophy. And so we've had scholars in West Africa, in East Africa, and increasingly now in Southern Africa, adopting his approach to creating viable philosophical practices in their own ethnic contexts. You have Yoruba philosophers, for instance, trying to see how certain Western concepts work within the Yoruba concept. You have the South African languages and philosophers using the same approach. You have it also across West Africa as well. So that has been quite influential in adopting a decolonial approach to philosophy, to culture, to linguistics, to language, and to existence as well, because it's also a question of a critique of modernity, and also a way to create an alternative path to creating modernity within the African context. Like I said, it's quite influential. It's apparently simple, apparently straightforward, but it's very effective having a decolonial critique of modernity and philosophy and culture as a whole. So that is in summary, is very reduced contributions to what I would call a decolonial approach to philosophy, to modernity, to culture in Africa. The next philosopher I'll be discussing is the work of Paul Otunji, his great contemporary. They worked very closely together. They formed all kinds of research networks. They worked together in UNESCO-funded projects, went to the same conferences, published in the same journals. Paul Otunji, who I also had the privilege of working with quite briefly, but also quite influential in how I saw the task of a philosopher in modern Africa. Paul Otunji, he studied in the Sorbonne, as I mentioned, and he came back to Africa. And after his studies, he was influenced by some of the greatest philosophers of the day in France: Derrida, Canguilhem, Althusser, one other philosopher, about four of them, four major African French philosophers were some of his teachers at the Sorbonne. And then when he came back in the 60s, or before that, he got a grant to study an previously unknown and unrecognized African thinker. His name was Anton Willem Amu. He was a Ghanaian. He came from what was not Ghana, then was called the Gold Coast, and he was in Germany. He studied and he was a professor of philosophy in Germany in the 18th century. And he wrote several books and was quite accomplished, and eventually returned after a long spell in Germany back to the Gold Coast, but that was in the 18th century. But there was hardly, he wasn't well known. And that was Otunji's path to thinking of how to do philosophy within an African context. But Otunji was quite also very specific about the task of the philosopher and what philosophy ought to do. He wrote a lot of metaphilosophical papers on the issue of the project of philosophy, and he embraced and argued for the universalism of philosophy. He wasn't relativist in his approach. He thought philosophy should maintain the highest benchmarks of rigor, scientific rigor, and also universalism, that philosophy was a universal discipline, and it encompassed a universal approach, not just an African, and that philosophy should be applicable to all cultures in the same way. That was his approach, even as he was trying to rehabilitate and re-emphasize the the work of William Anton Amo. So he started to write philosophical, meta-philosophical papers on the question of what philosophy ought to be, and also the place of the African in it. His book, he published a very important book in 1976 in French. It's called African Philosophy, Myth and Reality, first published in France and then translated into English in 1983. And it was an eye-opener, was a revelation, very important, very groundbreaking, even before his colleague, because Kwesi Radio published his own book, his own landmark book, Philosophy and an African Culture, in 1980. So that was 4 years after Colon Otunji, even though Kwesi Radio was quite older than Colon Otunji. And so in that book, she did a few important things, which was a critique of Nkrumah, Kwame Nkrumah, and then he defined the task of what what the project of African philosophy is, which was very controversial. And that is when his colleague, Olabi Yai, who I'll talk about, came in. And so that was his first entry or first brush with what would become his views of African philosophy, his critique and rehabilitation of William Anton Amo, the 18th century Ghanaian philosopher. Then he went further to critique what he called the discourse of ethnophilosophy. The discourse of ethnophilosophy was actually a project of colonialist anthropology by scholars such as the Belgian priest Placide Tempels, who wrote Bantu Philosophy, first published in 1945 in French, and then translated very widely, which have made quite an impact. And in that, he tried to capture what he considered to be the African ontological worldview. And Colon Otunji was quite critical, quite scathing in his criticism of that, because he felt it was relativist, and it was also a philosophy, a discourse that wasn't philosophical because it didn't meet all these benchmarks of scientific rigor. So one of the ways Colon Otunji made his name in African philosophical circles was his very, very powerful critique of the work of those he called ethnophilosophers like Placide Tempels, and then later on the Rwandan priest called Alexis Kagame. So that is another aspect, critical aspect of Otunji's work. And he also had by extension, another concept he popularized. It wasn't his own, but he popularized it, the concept of unanimism. Unanimism is the concept that views Africans as undifferentiated whole, the kind of whole that was presented in the works of authors, colonial authors like Joseph Conrad, who in his Heart of Darkness saw Black Africans as just one undifferentiated mass of some sort of undifferentiated organism. I think not you. I hesitated. I wasn't going to say humanism. Also, undifferentiated mass of subhumanism, or subhumanity rather. So I mean, Otunji criticized that unanimism wasn't sufficiently aware on the differences within peoples of Africa and their cultures and what have you, that he would, just saw Africa as one on differentiated mass of subhumanity, as I said. So he was quite scathing of that concept as well. So again, that was viewed as part of his contributions to African philosophy. Then another concept that Otunji popularized was the end of his work career was his understanding of scientific dependency. Otunji claimed that most, as we are aware, most of the centers of intellectual production was based in the West. In the West, all the resources for the best to produce world-class scholarly work was located in the West, and the Africans and Africa just seen as a site for raw material, for intellectual raw material, where you can have native informants. The scholars are relegated to the status of native informants, whilst the scholars, their counterparts in the West, they produce real producers of the knowledge. So he spent a lot of his work or time critiquing this international division of labor, in which Africans were relegated to producers of raw materials also which would be extended to even the economic realm, economic sphere, in which raw materials are taken to the to metropolitan centers and reproduced, and refined and manufactured, and then sent back to Africa as finished products, and they're more expensive when such exportation takes place. And this is also continuing to this day, because I understand most of our refineries in Nigeria are not working, so you take crude oil to the Western world or whatever, and then they are refined. The crude oil is refined and brought back. Otunji spent a lot of his time critiquing this unfair balance of relations of production, both not only just principally in this case in the intellectual realm and philosophical realm, and then the best libraries, the best journals, the best publishing houses are located in the metropolitan centers, by which I mean France, in the UK, in the US, and other Western countries. And then the raw materials for production we find in Africa. That also applies to the realm, like I said, of intellectual production. So that's another concept that's quite important to understand when we understand this Colin Otunji's work. The final concept I want to focus on is the concept of endogenous knowledge. Endogenous knowledge, for me, is actually a reinscription of the notion of the project of ethnophilosophy, because what endogenous knowledge in Otunji's understanding is the recuperation of indigenous knowledge systems in archaeology, pharmacology, what you call the ethnosciences, various ethnosciences, perhaps it could be ethnobiology, ethnozoology, what have you. And how he did it was he used his students. The students, he organized a seminar, and then he assigned his students, his postgraduate students, the task of recuperating these indigenous knowledge systems and units of knowledge, and that could be presented in a modern format for dissemination, which he did in a project called Endogenous Knowledge Research Trails. published first in French by Codestra Depart in 1994, and then translated into English in 1997 by Ghanaian scholar and novelist Amakwesi Ama. Yeah, Amakwesi Ama. Just yeah. So which was translated in 1997, and so although Otunji did not actually, he wrote a very interesting introduction for the volume, quite a big volume, but he did not actually carry out a project by himself because I think part of the work entailed ethnography, doing field work, and being a philosopher, I think perhaps he despaired about doing that kind of field work because it was philosopher theorists and what have you. But he had other people do that kind of work, and then he wrote a long introduction, and he found, and it was like his silent nod to saying that certain philosophical systems are indigenous to Africa and should be taken in a serious philosophical way. That is what I read this project of ethnophilosophy. Sorry, or rehabilitation of ethnophilosophy. We didn't call it a rehabilitation. I see it as a rehabilitation of ethnophilosophy by other means. That's by this embrace of the general project of endogenous knowledge. So that is the final concept that is quite important to Paulo Otunji. I mentioned the first one, the rehabilitation about William Anton Amo. I mentioned the second one, which is the critique of unanimism, and then the discourse of ethnophilosophy, and then the question of scientific development, dependency, and then finally the project of endogenous knowledge. So quite a number of concepts that are quite important to understanding Paulo Otunji's contribution to modern African philosophy, and they can be taken as a critique of the hegemonic heritage of Western philosophy, because it is trying to introduce an African voice to what was largely a white-dominated discipline, an approach to knowledge production. So that is, even though he didn't present it as such, but the implications of what he did of his work that's what his work is saying. So that's my conclusion on the work contributions of Paulo Otunji. The final philosopher I want to discuss. Do I still, how much time do I have? I hope I'm not going to overtime. Hello?
No, you are not going to overtime. I think you are like something like 35 minutes. You still have 10 minutes.
Okay, great, wonderful.
Thank you.
The third thinkers and scholar I want to discuss is Paulo Otunji's contemporary, Olabi, who was born in 1939, died in 2020. Out of all these three philosophers, he's the one most closely I worked with, because we worked together in a UNESCO-funded project, which is still ongoing. I'll talk about the project shortly, but his contributions have been quite stellar. I mean, he's so important to me, even though he's not as well discussed as these two other philosophers. He's not, and he's also largely known within both, not only philosophical circles, but also in linguistics, because he was a multidisciplinary scholar. He was a Renaissance man because he spoke several languages.
Sorry, Professor. Sorry, Professor, could you please tell us again the name of this third philosopher?
Olabi Yai. Olabi Yai from Benin Republic. Olabi Yai. I can write it for you and send it. Olabi Yai. He's from Benin. He was from Benin Republic. Colin Otunji's contemporary. And he was born in 1939, and he died in December 2020. He also studied in the Sorbonne, like Colin Otunji, and then he came to Nigeria to do his master's. He worked at the University of Ibadan. That was in the 1960s. He worked in the University of Ibadan. Then he went to University of Ife, which is Obafemi Awolowo University now. Now, first of all, his introduction to African philosophical circles was his seminal paper called Theory and Practice in African Philosophy. Theory and Practice in African Philosophy, which was published by Second Order, a very important philosophy journal based at the University of Ife, then now Obafemi Awolowo University, in 1977, in which he was a critique of Colin Otunji's book. He charged Otunji of intellectual elitism. He was a socialist leftist critique, because socialism was quite popular in academic circles in those days, in the 1970s. And so he was a very, very powerful critic, one of the most powerful critiques of Otunji's book, and also the earliest, because it came out shortly after that. And then he published a Yoruba dictionary, Yoruba/English dictionary in 1995. He didn't publish books like Weredu or Tunji, just published research papers in different journals and books. But it was very important because he was also trying to he embarked on a project of trying to recuperate endogenous knowledge systems within primarily the Yoruba context and the Fon context of Benin Republic. And he did that across several disciplines: art history, philosophy, culture, language, whatever. Quite multidisciplinary, and he spoke several languages as well. Spoke French, English, Portuguese, Spanish. An extraordinary human being and scholar. Like I said, much less well known than Weredu or Colin Otunji. Now, but why he's important to this discussion is that he after working in the US for quite a while, he worked at the University of Florida, where he retired, Florida, and then I think International University of Florida, and then he went over to UNESCO in Paris, where he spent several years as well. He was Benin's permanent representative to UNESCO, and then he became executive chair of the UNESCO board. And whilst he was executive chair of the UNESCO board, he initiated a project, the 9th volume of the General History of Africa. And within that project, he embarked with Marshal Z. Belinga of Cameroon on what they call the Epistemological Forum. And in this project, they drew scholars from Europe, from Africa, from the United States, from South America, Central America, the Caribbean, and they wanted to. It was a decolonial project. They were looking at the question of decolonization on a global scale. Very important, because what they were trying to deal with is the concept of global Africa. So a global Africa. So it was a contract a concept that unites the African homeland and its multiple diasporas because they are united by common histories of slavery, of colonialism, and decolonization. And this is an ongoing project. Unfortunately, it passed on, but it's ongoing because what they try from these various research contributions from different parts of the world, they're going to have it translated. The volumes are going to be published in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic. Like I say, it passed on. So he focused exclusively on the project of intellectual decolonization, but also on the concept of global Africa. And it was a linking of various aspects of the African intellectual project as it relates to decolonization. So that's the contributions of Olabi Yai to intellectual decolonization in Africa and its multiple diaspora through his elaboration of this concept of global Africa. Now, I just want to say quite quickly the relationships between my abstract between Brazil, Afro-Brazilian intellectual traditions and the West African intellectual traditions. As we know, a lot of West Africans were trekking over to Brazil and other Africa and Southern American regions and countries during the slave trade. And a lot of them carried with them their traditions, their modes of worship, their cosmological systems, their worldviews, and what were transported with them, their music, their culture, everything was transported with them, even their food, their cuisine. And then in 1835, there was a huge rebellion of these African slaves. And then the Portuguese slave masters thought, okay, if you are not willing to assimilate, to find peace and find peace with the status quo here, the racial status quo in Brazil, then you are free to go back to Africa. And a lot of slaves, formerly held slaves, captives, came back to Africa, and they went to different regions or different countries within West Africa, Nigeria, Benin Republic, Togo, Ghana, Sierra Leone, perhaps even also Cote d'Ivoire. And they brought back their Afro-Brazilian traditions in terms of the cuisine, the architecture, the culture, the music and dance, and assimilated it in the local populations. And it created a cross-fertilization between Brazilian/Portuguese traditions and West African traditions, in terms of the cosmological understandings of their history, their culture, and the world. And that has also shaped certain intellectual patterns within these two regions, between West Africa and Brazil. I could talk more on that, but I would stop here for now so that we could have discussions and time for that. And I'll elaborate as how that perhaps also has an impact on decolonial theory and critique. But I'll stop here for now, so I'll wait to when there are questions and then to be able to elaborate on the disconnections between Brazil and West Africa on their historical backgrounds and interactions. I thank you all for your time and your patience.
Thank you.
I look forward to a very interactive session.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Osha. I will give you now the floor to Dr. Philip Olayoku. Please, you're welcome, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Barbara, for inviting me to discuss this very wonderful and very topical paper. Also, I would like to appreciate Professor Shola Olonyomi, my advisor, my PhD advisor of the Institute of African Studies, for also recommending. Thank you, Professor Osha, for your very insightful presentation. I'll just try to attempt, if I can, a brief summary of this very robust scope of paper. So you started through conceptual clarification, of the themes that you wanted to discuss on the colonial approaches in African epistemologies within the Global South. So you spoke about the concept of decoloniality, of course, popularized by Mignolo and Torres, but delimited to the African perception of the concept of decoloniality. So the genealogy of the use of the term within this scope was the African conception of it. Of course, alluding to the fact that Mignolo himself admitted that he learned of this concept from African scholarships. Of course, you reference people like Kwasi Wiredu, Ngugi Watiogo, Olabi Iyai, and all the, of course, Pauline Otonji, who are like the three focal scholars whose work that you touched on. You also talked about Africana epistemology, which you described as how African epistemologies have influenced intellectual traditions, across the globe. So you're not limiting it just within the continent of Africa in terms of geography, but extending the understanding of African epistemologies to the African diaspora, of course, which is how you ended your lecture with the Brazilian or the hybridity between the Brazilian and West African concepts. And you also discussed the fact that your intervention on Global South will be within the scope of the same geography. So you mentioned the bit on Kwasi Wiredu, whose work focused on conceptual decolonization. Also to mention to our audience that the period of intervention of these scholars was the time in which they were trying to define what African philosophy was and who an African philosopher was, just to give like a background context. And so these scholars at the time had to look for ways in which to create a relevance for African philosophy within the global scheme of things. And Wiredu did this through his conceptual decolonization. Of course, what he did was to make interventions through his own Akan culture, where he was looking at concepts such as truth, God, mind, facts, and see their viability within the linguistic context of exploration. And I think this intervention in itself is very important, because if we look at the role of language in terms of epistemologies or production, they talk about translanguaging these days in the sense that we draw from our linguistic repertoire. Knowledge itself is highly dependent on language. I mean, this could be subject to different contestations, but if what we know are actually captured in different linguistic components, that is why it's important to make linguistic interventions, such as the one that Wiredu did. But he was looking at the viability of Western concepts as his own start point to what was happening in his to what was happening in his own. And when Prof was making his interventions, I was thinking of people like scholars like Ogumodede, who have argued that authentic African philosophy, which itself is controversial in terms of conceptualization, well, could only be done in African languages. I'm not saying that Prof alludes to these aspects of it, but I think Ogumodede's discussion on the use of African languages was also linked to the thought processes of Africans in understanding the environment, because language, like I earlier mentioned, is important in what we know, even in terms of what we can memorize, and what we know is what we can memorialize and reproduce. And so this is often done in different languages. And so the understanding of language is something that is very critical. He said that it was important for as a decolonial approach to philosophy because it was a sort of like a critique of modernity, looking for alternate pathways, to modernity in the time in which they were trying to create relevance for themselves. The second scholar that he discussed extensively was also Pauline Otonji. Sorry if I didn't pronounce that right. So whose work, he discussed across 4 different layers. First is the rehabilitation of Anton William Amo, who was little known before he discussed about him, a German, of course, well, an African philosopher who acted from the diaspora and he was one of the earliest persons that showed that Africans could actually relate and express themselves along the same lines of European philosophy, engaging with Western philosophers at this time. The second thing that Otonji also the second intervention of Otonji was his metaphilosophical papers, which was basically a critique of Bantu philosophy or ethno-philosophy. People like Placid Tempels, Alexis Kagame, and those whose work he felt were not rigorous enough or didn't measure up to the scientific rigor as expected in Western philosophy. He also spoke about the critique of unanimism, where the continent is boxed, into a particular label of subhuman. I think that's what subhumanity, undifferentiated whole of subhumanity, as he captioned it, to say that we need to. Otonji was telling us that we need to recognize specificities between different African cultures, and this could be the entry point in understanding even the thought processes, of these different cultures. He also spoke about scientific dependency, which is the epistemology of, or the power dynamics of epistemological engagements across the globe, where what is advanced seems to be outside of the continent. And so we'll always look, and the continent itself, just as in the economic sphere, is considered a space of raw, intricate knowledge, which has to perhaps be exported to be refined. And the fourth, which I see as an evolution of his scholarship, is the bit on the indigenous knowledge system interventions, which he said was like an institution of ethno-philosophical knowledge, recuperating indigenous knowledge systems across different disciplines, especially those that relate to what we practice, indigenously, if I could use that term in a very broad sense, and so that's it. The last philosopher I mentioned was Olabiyi Yai, wrote a work on the theory and practice of African philosophy, who critiqued Otonji's work as an intellectual elitist. Of course, I could understand that based on the fact that scientific rigor could imply a sort of downplaying the values of some ethnophilosophical outputs. And also his work on the Yoruba dictionary, which was like recuperating indigenous knowledge systems, and also his ongoing work, even if it had passed, on the 9th volume of the General History of Africa. Of course, there are several volumes of that, which I myself have benefited from, and different scholars, in the past who wrote on different periods of African history, as Ade Ajayi and the rest of them. Even Shoyinka has a contribution in some of those volumes. Very notable African scholars have contributed to that. So he was looking at it within the frame of global Africa, as a sort of intellectual decolonization. And Professor Osha ended his intervention by telling us about the Afro-Brazilian context, of people who felt out of water within the Brazilian culture, returned to Africa and engaged in a sort of cultural hybridity where they infused, this Brazilian Portuguese culture, into the African context. Thank you very much, Prof, for your very great intervention. I would like to start my own little observation on the aspects of these philosophers and their approach to decolonization or decoloniality. And I look at the work of some scholars. In this instance, I'm looking at Kopani, Muscat, and Smith, who wrote on post-colonial responses to decolonial interventions. And the first thing that the core of their work that I appreciated was the fact that post-coloniality and decoloniality are moments in anti-coloniality in itself. And so, if, of course, scholars like PPAK have, in his inaugural lecture on colonialism and social structure, spoke about colonialism either as an epoch or an episode. And I think these scholars' intervention are talking about these different moments, post-coloniality and decolonization as moments, of anti-colonial struggle. And so the difference or the debates between these two groups would be that post-coloniality seems to infer a continuum, of a neo-colonial continuum within the continent to define colonialism itself or as an episode as an epoch in African history. While decolonization are trying to, or decolonialist scholars are trying to emphasize the discontinuum of this intervention. And it is on this basis that I would also like to ask Prof whether we can actually regard these scholars that you mentioned, who understandably at the time they wrote were battling with the concept of measuring up with what you can refer to as the Western standards of doing philosophy at the time, whether these were actually decolonial scholars or anti-colonial scholars, given that if you consider ethnophilosophy, as a start point or as the repertoire of a knowledge system, given that different cultural contexts, whether Africa or outside of Africa, have their own knowledge systems embedded in different linguistic repertoires, whether it's in proverbs, songs, or whatever, undermining such as not rigorous enough, as Otonji told us, or trying to fit an external knowledge system within, within the African content. And I'm using African now in a very particularistic sense of the Akan to say, to fit in Western linguistic concepts into those, to check their viability, already signals an epistemological power dynamics that would try to enforce some of these indigenous, if I could use the word, or these African thought processes, into the Western paradigm. And this is the first question that I would love to put to Prof. I also want to, and my reasoning for that is because I could understand that the challenge of rigor could be because there was a sort of like an authorial challenge when it comes to some of these knowledge systems, as it was not like personalized, but a communal approach to knowledge production. Should this in itself be something that undermines the quality of what obtains, within the variants of this African epistemological repertoire that we have, across different cultures? Because I would imagine that the start point, and that's what I align with Olabi Baola Yai, that the start point of intervention should be from the African knowledge system itself. Of course, I know in one of your works that you shared, you spoke about the Afrocentricity, of course, that is added with American scholarship. And these are like the Egyptologists, if I could use that word, who argue that Africa is the foundation of civilization itself. And we wouldn't want, of course, like scholars like Irele have also mentioned, to involve ourselves in Vegeta metaphor of trying to create exclusivity to different knowledge systems, but to consider, the epistemology, the understanding of global knowledge within a particular historical, a phylogenetic mode of a narrative of persons, a narrative of communities, a narrative of individuals who have a common destiny, and each of these individuals, each of these groups who belong in this global sphere, contributing to it at different phases. So this would be my major question to you, Prof. And I thank you very much for your very robust intervention, of this work. And I look forward to engaging more with our audience. Thank you once again, Dr. Barbara. I think I've used my 15 minutes. That's why I'm trying to stop. If I've not, we can continue with the Q&A, then we'll detail it. Thank you very much.
You have, but it was very interesting. Thank you, Dr. Philip. Please, Professor Osha, you have again the floor if you want to reply.
Thank you very much, Professor Olayoku. I really appreciate your discussion and your responses. Very, very detailed, very accurate for the most part, and I'm actually quite impressed by the amount of information you shared with us. And also the very insightful and very pertinent comments you made after your summary of my presentation. And then the questions, I don't regard them as questions, I regard them as very important contributions to the debate. They're not questions, they are commentaries, they are critiques, and I think most of it is well taken. The project of decolonization, like Ngugi said, it's a vast project, it's multidisciplinary, it's several layers, several levels, and various ways. And thanks also for pointing out the philosopher who you mentioned said we should do, the scholar who you mentioned said we should not to do philosophy in African languages, but in the language. That has been said, for instance, we know from Obiwali in that 1963 conference in Kampala when he said African literature should be produced in African languages and not European languages. Even before that, Sheikh Anta Diop had advocated for that kind of stuff, that kind of project, yes. So you do have all this and pushbacks and what have you, but you must also recognize that most of the institutions that produce us are Western oriented, the colonial universities, most of them. They're not, a lot of them are actually unreconstructed. A lot of them, even where you are in the University of Ibadan, is a product of colonial worldviews, colonial history, colonial administration. A lot of it is not even quite. Part of it is I think parts of the curriculum approach is still very Western oriented, and so you have all these pushbacks between assimilation, rejectionism, and then finding a balance, the ambivalence of the colonial situation, which has been theorized in post-colonial theory by the fathers of post-colonial theory, from Spivak, who has actually turned the back on post-colonial theory, and Homi Bhabha, and Edward Said, and the question of ambivalence. I neither this or that, in between. You're staying in between because you're a product, whether you like it or not. Even when you are critiquing Western hegemony, you're still a product of Western hegemonic practices and culture and education. The question of ambivalence, and also the question of nativism. If you go to the extreme of rejectionism, then it becomes a form of it becomes a form of nativism. And then if you become too invested within the Western philosophical or epistemological or / intellectual heritage, then you are seen by those like Chinwezu and Co. as a totally colonized mind, needing decolonization. So these are these terms are changing. They're always changing from post-colonial theory, now we're into decoloniality. These debates have been going on for forever, even from the time of the Pan-Africanists, Chancellor Williams, Edward Blyden, down to Kwame Nkrumah and Marcus Garvey. These debates have been going on. What is the identity of an African, the identity of a native, and what is the... And so it's been a question also of the discourse of power. When certain regions or people acquire so much power, it becomes their project to impose their will and their view, their cosmology upon the entire world, and they expect the world to follow them. These debates have been going on forever, and it doesn't change. It hasn't changed because we also live in a very unequal world with unequal relations in terms of power, in terms of economic production, in terms of intellectual production, and that also affects cultural standing. Because if, for instance, we have weak political systems and weak economic systems, then it means that our soft power too will be extremely weak or even non-existent, because we don't have the resources, we don't have the infrastructure to project our subjectivity and our values upon the world, and we're marginalized and whatever. So it's a question of power. It's all a question of power, how power is shared. And power isn't actually shared, power is imposed, and how it's imposed. There's a Foucauldian thing also in terms of how those who wield the levers of power have a way of imposing their ways, and then the dynamics of oppression and subjugation are always there, and it's changing, it's moving, and what have you. And there's also the dynamics of resistance. I mean, it's the prerogative and the duty of the weak to resist oppression, to resist hegemonic systems that are oppressive and that dehumanize and disempower them. And so it's a constant contestation of power, the position of power, the resistance to the rejection to it, and also, and it will go on for as long as the world remains a fundamentally unequal place and fundamentally unfair. But I respect your views and comments. I don't see them as questions. These are commentaries, these are critiques that you have to be taken seriously, and I know they're quite well intentioned, and they hit the right chord with me. So I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Dr. Philip, would you like to add some observations before we open to the floor to the other question and answers?
Yeah, just very briefly, Prof, I really appreciate your intellectual humility. I must admit that's the word for it, and I'm honored. The only thing I also want to mention is I understand the power dynamics of this, and how it's going to be on forever. But I wanted to just allude to Fanon's black-skin white mask and his concept of desalination, which I think fits into the project of decoloniality, or whatever we want to label it, since these things have evolved over time. And I was talking about, of course, we all know he is more of a psychological scholar, if I could use that word. He deals with the psyche most times because of his discipline. And I was talking about desalination as something that has to do with the liberation of both the oppressed and the oppressor from the habits of dehumanization. And the point I'm trying to make with this is the fact that is it possible to make this decolonial project something of a mission beyond different geographies. And the reason why I say this is that each time there has been resistance, I make allusions to where you are in South Africa, for instance, and our techno-oligarch, Musk, who has been very critical, of the reappropriation of land, of course, which itself adds its own controversy. And these different aspects of resistance and trying to right the wrongs of the past have always created new layers of disenfranchisement, new layers of oppression, new layers of dispossession, looking at these kind of things happen generations over. Even though the current generation will not say that they're not beneficiaries of what happened in the past. So that's, but if we look at the aspects of finance intervention, of liberating both the oppressed and the oppressor from this aspect of dehumanization, how can we make this decolonial project, whether in the epistemological way, whether in the economic way, whether in the political angle, a project that everybody keys into? Because I think this, and this is nothing new, this is just how narratives of mediating in oppressive contexts have always come across. To say that you cannot say, for instance, you're talking gender, you cannot say that your audience are basically women while you are leaving out the men out of it. Or you cannot say you want to upturn the context of putting women in places to displace men. This will also breed new oppressive strategies. So relating this to the decolonial or decolonization project itself, is it feasible for us to start a school of thought that embraces people from different spheres of life, in terms of the knowledge production, to really attack this challenge of asymmetry, and work together towards, as people that we think have, or we know, or we appreciate, have a common destiny together. Thank you, Prof.
Again, thank you so much for another very insightful comment and question. Because more of a critique, more of a comment than a question. Because some of the questions and some of the angles I can't answer. I guess, but they're very important questions. Very important questions. I think there will always be oppression, but the thing is to try and remain vigilant, to maintain critical vigilance, to be able to try and resist it, to try and question it, to try and subvert it. As long as there's always there's oppression, there should be also be ways to resist and try and overcome it. That's how the world unfortunately runs. It runs in the dynamic between, or the relationship between the master and the slave, the weak and the poor. And you mentioned the question of Fanon, who, for instance, has become quite important actually in South Africa. Like that for a few years now. There's not because there's a lot of focus on the colonial processes, so for several reasons. And so Fanon has been read by all kinds of people. It depends from different theoretical and ideological positions, and been reinterpreted not in the kind of generous and truthful way in which you've read him. I mean, people are reading him quite insidiously, quite mischievously, to also entrench certain old positions. People are doing that. But I'd say this too. Your question is very important. There's a very important, and then your insight to say that what can be done to make the world more equitable, to restore balance. But that is a $1 trillion question. We have a world that has eaten 10 billion people. 10 billion people. A lot of them are oppressed, and then maybe out of that, maybe they say 1% of the world has most of the resources, material resources. So it makes the world quite uneven. We have all kinds of voices coming up now, voices different interests. So as we have more people, you have different interests. Societies become more complex. Our states are failing because they don't have the capacity to cater to people. Even though the politicians continually lie, we produce jobs, we do this, we do that, and they fail on their promises. They just want power for whatever reasons they have. Want power, they have to maintain their positions. So the more people we have, the less institutions we have to cater to them in a humane way, the more complex our problems are going to get. And it seems our problems are going to get more complex because we have far more people. The states are failing, the institutions are failing, they're not enough, they're not sufficient. People are there. You have several non-state actors everywhere. That's what, and all over Africa, or even in Nigeria, the northeastern part has been held hostage by terrorists and bandits and what have you. And it's not only common to Nigeria, it's common even in South Africa. You have all kinds of mafias, gangs, and what have you. So the question of policing and regulation and providing safety, providing services, entrenching the values of democracy and civil rights becomes far more difficult to manage. And so we can expect, I think, far greater challenges, far enormous challenges, because our systems are not evolving as fast as they are, and they should. And when they do evolve, they tend to benefit the economically privileged and the politically privileged, which would in turn lead to greater sense of dispossession, sense of oppression, sense of resistance, or necessity for resistance. So it's still because of the fundamentally uneven nature of the world. And when you mentioned Elon Musk and how, for instance, he seems to be a rightist, a kind of conservative, kind of reactionary view in terms of how he sees how the world should be run. And it's like he's talking for only the powerful, for the few against the many. And once that occurs, we can expect far more discontent and rebellion and what it is. Like I said, because the world has gotten much larger, we have far more people, and so it's much more difficult to govern, even though with AI, in the age of AI and what have you, and newer technologies of control and surveillance. So that is also taking place. We're having more sophisticated drones and what have you to police and control. But you also have a large mass of people who are left out of, who are falling through the cracks of the system, and they're not included in the system. So you cannot always monitor what they're doing, and they would always resist because they're excluded, and they have every right to kind of resist their oppression. But it's a somewhat bleak situation in terms of we live in like I mentioned earlier, we live in a fundamentally unequal world, equal between nations, within nations, and within societies, within communities, sometimes within families. So several levels of inequality and inequity. And so there are several instances between gender, within gender. So several instances that invite resistance and rebellion. So, yeah. But your point is well taken. Thank you so much.